by drink and drugs find themselves wrapped by only another layer of evil and pain, deeper than before. Indeed, the real question when it comes to evil is how one ought to bother with it, not if one bothers with it. All people must bother with evil from the moment they are born. The question of life is, what then shall we do? In other words, how ought we behave given that we must face evil? Yet Anderson does not overtly acknowledge this feature of human life. Rather, his assumption at the outset is that this is a question which someone might genuinely want answered, though the motivation for seeking an answer is unclear. In the end, Anderson answers his initial question by pointing to the fact that there might be some benefit or redemption that would come from evil, with which he also lumps the ugly, dissonant, atrocious, confounding, and false. One such benefit of evil is what he calls groundedness, knowing what we could go wrong, or I think where we could go wrong, sorry, typo. Elsewhere, he calls this freedom from blindness, with which supposedly one might be prepared for the coming evils of this life and have some hope of redemption, so that what seems evil would turn out good or ultimately beneficial. Anderson's discussion of the musical genius who creates music that is initially rejected as ugly and distasteful, but is eventually seen as beautiful and innovative, is clearly meant to be at least an analogous situation to that of evil. Though notably, Anderson does not explicitly mention it. It seems simply that the redemption of evil is supposed to be a sort of greater good, which in some way stands up to the magnitude of evil. Otherwise, if what he is referring to is not some sort of greater good, it is hardly a consolation to the sufferer that they should have an inconsequential benefit in return for a lifetime of evil. It is not only this core question Anderson addresses, along the way he speaks more generally about the definition of evil, along with his views of the aesthetic and ethical natures of evil. By examining these, we can hope to gain a clearer perspective of Anderson's view of evil itself. Definitional matters. Among the most famous trinities, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, etc., surely the transcendentals, truth, beauty, and goodness, rank among the most famous. In the definitional discussion of evil in Anderson's essay, a most curious feature is that while truth and its opposite falsity, and beauty and its opposite ugliness feature prominently, goodness nearly goes unmentioned. Typically, the only reason it is even useful to speak of evil is as an opposite, and in many cases, a deficiency of good. For example, we say that killing an innocent person is evil and not good because the good thing to do is to allow or support the innocent life, not destroy it. Evil is charged with a primarily ethical meaning relating to the good, even if one holds that evil is only a description of a culturally relative impulse or emotional response. The term still describes something relating to the good and the ethical. Even in common use, where admittedly people tend only to use the word for the worst sorts of events, such as the Holocaust, mass shootings, or terrorist attacks, the term is not understood as referring to the appearance of the event as beautiful or ugly, though these do typically appear ugly. And it is also not used to describe the truth or falsity of the events, if it happens as reported or not, though surely the emotional impact is greater if the event actually happens. These events are called evil, even if they are imagined and do not exist, or if they are performed in the most beautiful and elegant way possible. Evil is a different sort of category of description from the true and beautiful. Anderson does describe different types of evil, but when it comes to actually defining what evil is, it is hard to pinpoint Anderson's position, being that he tends to rely on examples which inspire our intuitive disgust in order to give an idea of the concept. At one point, he does quote a description by M. Singer, who says that evil is the worst possible term of opprobrium imaginable. This does approximate the way Anderson uses the word, but what is never clearly addressed is why evil is an opprobrious thing in the first place. If it is based on an intuition or repulsion, that only pushes the question back another level. The question still remains why those impulses should cause those feelings worthy of opprobrium. These are answers to the question, how do we detect or respond to evil? they do not define the thing itself. The usual understanding of evil as opposite or deprivation of good is made more difficult to understand by the image of a Cartesian plane with a good axis and an evil axis. If good and evil are different dimensions, it is hard to understand what they are or how they relate. The image is an attempt to describe good or evil without oversimplification and intellectualization. In other words, he provides this image because he seeks to avoid judgment that either so far divides up something into small parts of good and bad, which is what I take him to mean by intellectualization, or make broad sweeping judgments of the whole, oversimplification. The goal of avoiding oversimplification is a good one, but it is unclear why parsing an issue into its relevant aspects and parts, and then judging those parts, is wrong. Anderson does some of this intellectualization himself when he notes the thing itself, which is separate from the response to that thing, i.e. Psyche's beauty from the people's response, and pain of a tragedy from the impact it has in the long run. Without the ability to look at individual parts, it is unclear how one might make any of these judgments at all. Evil is falsity. Anderson says that things that are false in a confounding sense, i.e. lies, have such a repulsive effect on us that we consider them evil in like manner to the way we call things we are morally repulsed by as evil. This is not the only way to view these moments of falsehood. One might see the lie and be repulsed by it, but that does not mean that the thing in and of itself is evil. It means that the deception is evil. If this alternative is true, it is the case that lies strike us as morally repulsive, but that does not mean that evil and falsehood are the same. The example of hope is a curious contribution to this discussion. Anderson holds that hope is a lie that we believe so that we keep going rather than commit suicide. Even granting the non-standard and dismal definition, we need not hold, as Anderson says, that this is evil because it is false, but an evil which, and I made a typo here, I meant to say, also has good effect because it preserves human life. It would not be a good thing at all to continue on if all hope is truly a lie. That would be an evil thing in and of itself. Living a life deceived would be an improvement on that, but it would be a meaningless blip of existence and death. Any good ascribed to that existence would be a further lie. Anderson does, however, call evil action out of accordance with reality at one point, which would suggest that he thinks that evil is in some way unreal. This is hard to understand unless he holds to a privation theory of evil, which he seems to deny by arguing that good and evil are different dimensions rather than ways to describe fullness and privation of the same thing. Furthermore, if evil is not in accord with reality, it cannot also contain some amount of truth, as Anderson says it must have elsewhere. Evil as aesthetic. A major feature of Anderson's work is his analysis of the ways in which what is initially thought to be beautiful or ugly, in the end, can be considered something beautiful. He cites the reception of some music, even by Bach and Beethoven, along with several modern musical innovations like atonal music, as examples of this phenomenon. In his conclusion to this section of the paper, Anderson clarifies his view of the relationship to beauty and ugliness to evil, especially in music. He says that it is unlikely that music and the arts are an exception to some overarching rule stating that evils are immutable, and goes on to say, based on this, that while evil is not beautiful, it does not have to stay that way. Just as beauty is not evil, but it can bring about evil as its consequence, evil can bring about beauty as one of its consequences. While it is unclear from where this overarching rule is derived, Anderson clearly holds that something or someone who is beautiful can inspire evil, as Psyche's beauty, in the example he cites from Ovid, inspires evil responses. This is true. The vice of envy is famous for leading people to act in very evil ways as a response to a good thing that someone else possesses, famously beauty. Though it hardly implies that beauty is morally suspect or necessarily leads others to evil. The beauty and the evil response are two distinct things. Just because someone decides to respond wrongly to a good thing does not in the least mean that that good thing should be suspect. Furthermore, Anderson says that evil can bring about beauty. This is another true point. We certainly do find rebirth from the ashes, recovery, redemption, and resurrection to be very beautiful. Yet again, there is an error of separating an action from the response to an action. When a city is razed to the ground and the people are killed or driven out, this is certainly an evil thing. If that city is rebuilt more beautifully than ever, this is certainly a very good and beautiful thing that would potentially not have happened but for the evil action. It does not, however, in any way make the action of razing the city a beautiful thing. It is still evil, and there would have been no beauty from it as a consequence, but for other good, independent actions taken in response. This also relates to art and Anderson's thinking, because he associates ugliness and evil with each other. Thus, he holds that, for example, a musical piece which is considered ugly and thus evil might one day be seen as beautiful. This is an interesting suggestion, although it does not prove that evil and ugliness are the same thing, simply because they are frequent bedfellows. Evil and ethics. In the final portion of his essay, Anderson discusses ways in which evil might relate to ethics, specifically virtue ethics, followed by a discussion of if we have a moral duty to interact with evil. Markedly, he does not seek to reconcile these two contradictory meta-ethical theories. He does mention that he prefers not to discuss deontic or consequentialist ethics because they tend to dissolve into trolley problems and other tiresome thought experiments, which is very true. This does not explain why one theory should be considered above another. Even when Anderson goes into the specifics of virtue ethics, he does not specify how one might know what a virtue or a virtuous person is. He does say that many apparently virtuous actions can be seen to be evil given the right context. His examples include a person who keeps another person alive with medical care, each time after recurring periods of being tortured to the brink of death. Anderson says that it is an evil virtue to save someone's life and to force them to continue to face this unnamed torture. This is an interesting analysis, but without any clear definition of virtue, it is difficult to fathom what is meant by an evil virtue. Certainly, for the Aristotelian virtue ethicist, it would not be a virtuous person who kept someone alive solely for the sake of torturing them without end. Also, the act of keeping someone alive is indeed a great good, because life, even a miserable life, is better than none. Finally, in the discussion of a moral duty to witness evil, Anderson says that we have a duty to witness evil because of the good that might come from this instance. This is, again, a question that need not be asked. As mentioned above, people will face evil, regardless of if they consider it a moral duty or not, or if they seek it out or not. Concluding matters. The topic of evil is a deeply mysterious and difficult one, though I have disagreed with the main question of Anderson's work and found areas of criticism in his analysis. I do not think the broad sweep of interesting facets of this discussion I do think that the broad sweep of interesting facets in this discussion is an interesting way to enter into the conversation about the nature of evil. It is no small thing to bring all of these conversations about evil into one place, and it is surely helpful for future research to do so. Thank you.
All right, take it a little bit to clap back on that. I got to read this ahead of time, so I have notes. So I'm trying to make this a little quick because I reviewed most of these point by point, and it's a lot of work. To the first criticism you had, which is that people don't actually ask, why would I bother with evil? Everybody deals with evil, and it's not something you can avoid. There are actually people who live lives and they're allowed to avoid almost all the evil that they would have otherwise run into, be it poverty, hunger, bad parenting, bullying. These are things that people do avoid, and they often lack compassion as a result of that. Second, you pointed out that I lumped in evil with dissonance, atonality, ugliness. The list is present. And while I do think that those do go together, I think that lumping it in with them would be a sort of incorrect description. I think it's more of a, these are all things that are evil. And so evil's on a different level, and these are all categories of evil. And it's a descriptive conception. 3, the music discussion is supposed to be analogous to evil. It is a discussion of ugliness, which is an evil, and that does contrast with beauty, which is a type of good. And I would say that it's not as much an analogy and more of an exploration of good and evil in this narrower frame of aesthetics. You said that I point to a greater good that can be found from evil, and if I didn't, then the benefits would be inconsequential and they'd be terrible consolation for a lifetime of evil. I'm not actually trying to defend evil, I'm just trying to describe how we interact with it, how it shows up in the world. And so while it may be the case that there's a greater good, I'm not trying to explicate that. I'm just trying to show that there is some good. I don't define good as when I'm doing my definitional work. I don't define good as opposed to evil, and I do define the other ones. I think that those are maybe higher categories. And if I'll go through your argument, the only time it's useful to talk about evil is as the opposite of good. The evil is primarily charged with this ethical meaning relating to good, and that atrocities committed in the most beautiful way are still evil. I would say they still seem ugly too. Even the most beautiful atrocities. I mean, the example I thought of when I was reading this was the beginning of Gladiator, where there are two armies fighting. It's presented as very heroic, but I was actually quite disturbed by that scene. Well, it's still war. It's kind of disgusting what they're all doing. And so even though this is presented in the most beautiful, heroic way, it was still really ugly. Truth and falsity are about the reporting of events. I think that we just disagree on meanings here. When I said falsity, I meant falsity as in out of alignment with true beliefs, and true belief or false beliefs would be out of alignment with actual reality. And they're uncomfortable, those false beliefs, because they expose evil within us. And it's not really an existential claim so much. Number 6, Anderson does not define evil. Anderson doesn't want to define evil. The Marcus Singer quote about it being the worst term of opprobrium possible is a description of the current climate of discussion about evil. So the modern philosophy discussions of evil, particularly post-19th or 20th century atrocities, is in the class of this is the worst term of opprobrium, which is just a really fancy way of saying we really, really hate this thing. But quotes are quotes. But that's not actually the view that I attend to in this paper. That's the narrow view that he's describing. All right, 7th point. The Cartesian plane is confusing to us because it doesn't exactly work with the dualistic interpretation of good and evil, and avoiding intellectualization doesn't make sense. Two-parter. Part 1, I agree that it's confusing, but as I covered in my presentation, I think that the confusion is worthwhile for the amount of discussion that it allows and the granularity of conversation. And part 2, I do certainly consider individual parts of an event or a proposition, and any of those things, they have parts, some of which are good, some of which are evil. But I don't think that that's the dangerous part of intellectualization. I think the dangerous part is when you try to sum all of those parts together in their values and say, that was good, or that was bad. It's the combining down into something that you can pass judgments about that's the problematic type. You said that the confounding, or you conflated the confounding sense of evil with lies. I disagree. The world's not lying to us when we see clear water in a stream and think, oh, well, there's nothing making it dirty, that must mean it's safe to drink. That would be a terrible idea, because that's often very toxic water. But the world's not lying to us, it's just that we have a false belief. So evil in the confounding sense doesn't always mean lying. Number 9, things that are deceptive aren't evil. The deception is evil, and I completely agree with you, but I also think that the deception that it has is part of the thing itself. So this is a little bit of, it strays toward consequentialist ethics a little bit, which I don't fully understand, but I know that this is not it. I think that aspects of something do participate in the actual thing, and therefore are useful for the description of it. Let's see, did I talk about that already? Oh, yeah. The quote about hope stopping us from suicide by its lies is from a work of fiction, and I wanted to keep it exactly as it was. But I don't think that hope is necessarily a lie. I think it's a really good exception, because we do believe false things by hope, and that doesn't seem problematic to us. So it seems that it wouldn't necessarily be a lie. I'm not completely sure on that one, but it is certainly a useful exception that I wanted to include, even if I can't perfectly explain the whole idea around it. Number 10, we're almost done with my disagreements, I promise. Evil being out of accordance with reality, and that requiring a privation theory, and discord with reality meaning unreality. I don't think all of those things necessarily follow. Excuse me. Mostly here I'm talking about instantiations of events where beliefs are pointed outside of reality. And this is when they were previously treated as though they were within reality. And that doesn't require a privation theory, I think, because the thing that we find discomforting or evil is the learning that these things are out of accord with one another. And it's not the loss, you're not losing anything necessarily when you find out these do not agree. You're just gaining this new knowledge that is not comfortable to have. Although you could say that it is maybe a loss of confidence in your beliefs. But I don't know. Let's see. What was in there? I have another comment, but that might have just been a side comment. You asked what the overarching rule I was talking about, that, let's see, what was the exact, it was, when I was talking about these things being as an exception to some overarching rule of evils, I actually think